All right. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started here. Welcome to Lightning Components 101 and Apex Developer's Guide. My name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce engineer and Salesforce MVP at Google. I have over 600 Trailhead badges and 14 certifications, but I'm really passionate about helping people decode on the Salesforce platform. If you want to connect with me after, feel free to check me out on Twitter at Adam17AMO. You can shoot me an email, adam@adamtoarchitect.com. And if you still haven't yet migrated to the Lightning experience, I have a Pluralsight course to help you out, bit.ly/lightning migration. All right. So you've been seeing this slide all week. Just a reminder, Salesforce is a publicly traded company. Make all your purchasing decisions based on already available information. All right. And so with that, I want to get into kind of the reason why I wanted to give this talk today. So I started off as a Java developer. And I got into Salesforce, and I started working with Apex, and I was very happy doing that for a while. And I started hearing some terminology that kind of scared me a little bit that I ran away from. Terms like front end, JavaScript, client side. And I kept, going up my career mountain, just pushing these things behind me, and not really worrying about them too much. And then I started seeing statistics like this. Many of you are probably familiar with Stack Overflow. They do a yearly developer survey for professional developers. And 72,000 responses this year. For the 7th year in a row, JavaScript is the most commonly used software language. 70% of developers claim they use JavaScript. 63% HTML and CSS was in second place. So as you can see, these web languages are obviously pretty popular. And I also saw statistics like this from GitHub. JavaScript's been #1 in pull requests since 2013. Encompasses 20% of all pull requests on GitHub. In case you were interested, Apex is 39th. So JavaScript's been king for a little while now. At some point, all these terminology, front-end JavaScript type things, I kept pushing behind me. And one day I looked down, and JavaScript was very popular, and I didn't really know any of it. And it was a little overwhelming, and I wasn't really sure what to do about it. Backend was safe, and I really decided, OK, JavaScript is here to stay. I really need to get into it now. So that kind of leads me to the talk today, right? Just to level set some expectations, I'm kind of assuming you're all familiar with Apex Java, some form of back-end coding. I don't want you walking out of here thinking you're going to learn JavaScript in 40 minutes. I'm not sure if 40 hours would be enough time. But what I do want you to understand is common patterns that we see in both front-end and back-end code. And ultimately, I want you to walk out of here with more confidence to start building components and front-end code on your own. And so I'm kind of marketing this as step 1 of your journey to being either a front-end or full-stack developer, or even just improving your skills as a Salesforce developer. All right, so our agenda today, pretty straightforward. We're going to do a very, very brief review of Apex, an MVC framework that you already know. We're going to talk about what are these things called components. We're going to do some comparison between Visualforce and Lightning Web Components. We're going to do a deep dive demo of Lightning Web Components. And then we're going to sum things up and talk about step 2 after today. I was originally going to include Aura in here as well. But it's pretty clear to me, being at Dreamforce this week, if you haven't already learned Aura, probably not worth getting started on that. I'd recommend going straight into Lightning Web Components. So we're going to skip past Aura today. All right, so with that, very, very brief, like I said, Apex overview. So these are things we know, right? Apex pretty much comes in 2 flavors. You got your triggers, you got your classes or controllers, right? Your triggers are code that runs in response to some database event, right? Before insert, after update, event fires, code runs, right? We know how to do that. Classes, you're familiar with methods, parameters, return values, right? And then we got variables interspersed between the 2, right? This is our bread and butter as Apex developers. Right? We're also probably familiar with asynchronous Apex, right? Things like @future methods, where we don't want to make the user wait for our response, so we send it asynchronously. We also get to avoid some governor limits and things like that. And then the batchable interface, which is going to let us do things like do some additional processing, more records, things like that. It's an interface, so there's kind of rigid requirements of what you need to use it for, or methods you need to implement. But this is another tool in our arsenal. And apparently, Microsoft Office is not optimized. Well, that's unfortunate. All right. Let me try opening that up again because my PowerPoint crashed. All right. And if I go to, let's try this one more time. Needs to be updated, not now. OK. Good time for an update as usual. Thank you, Microsoft. All right. Let's get back in here and move ahead a little bit. All right. So we talked about forward-looking statement. We got all this stuff. Great. And back to Apex. All right. So assign Apex has some limitations, maybe a metaphor there. All right. So Visualforce, maybe it's a metaphor for Visualforce also. We all know it. We probably don't really love it, right? But it follows the MVC model. Apparently also crashes PowerPoint. Utilizes HTML style tags, right? Apex page, Apex button, Apex page block, et cetera. Bind variables, bind methods, right? We can reference things in our Apex controller from our UI. We're used to doing this, curly bracket bang, variable name. And ultimately, we find that Apex and Visualforce both have gaps, right? We run into governor limits. It's very button-click based. There's performance issues. We end up just throwing random script tags all over the place. Maybe we know what it does. Maybe we don't know what it does, but it works, so we don't worry too much about it. But we're not necessarily comfortable and happy with the code we're writing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a new programming model now. I like to call it MVC++, and we'll see why in a second here. First, I'm going to take you on a quick journey of Salesforce development, right? So Salesforce was founded late 90s. 90s and early 2000s, the internet was kind of coming into its own. People were happy, button clicking away, button click, a page loads, button click, something else happens, and that was fine. Dreamforce 2007, Salesforce launched Visualforce, a UI that you can implement for Salesforce. And that was fine for a while, but as we saw, JavaScript's been king since 2013. People started wanting a more responsive UI. They wanted to interact with the page and have it auto-update without having to click a bunch of buttons. And so August 2015, Salesforce launched the Lightning Experience and the Aura framework, right? A custom framework, open source framework with JavaScript that you can develop on the Salesforce platform. And that was fine for a little while, but Aura has its own issues, and web standards got better. And so early this year, January 2019, Salesforce then launched Lightning Web Components, which is more based on industry standard JavaScript. All right, so this is where we were in the happy Visualforce land, MVC, right? Everything's happening on Salesforce. Our Visualforce is there. Our data and metadata is there. Our Apex is there, right? And we're on our clients, our browsers. We're calling Salesforce, loads the Visualforce page, calls the backend, Apex, right? That's all happening on the server. And because it's making a ton of server calls, those are very expensive, and as a result, can be kind of slow. And so we're going to move to our new front-end JavaScript framework now, MVC++. Our Apex controller is not going anywhere. Apex still lives in Salesforce. The model's not going anywhere. The objects and fields are still in Salesforce. But we want to get better performance. So we're going to actually move the entire view over to the client side. Okay, the view is now in your browser directly. Right? And it kind of defeats the purpose if we have the view in the browser and have to make Apex calls every time. So we're also going to put a controller into the browser. We're going to put a controller in the client side. So now you have both a client and a server-side controller. Client in the browser, or controller in the browser, controller on Salesforce. Right? This is sometimes known as MVCC. Right? We have two controllers now, one of which is on the client side. That's going to be our JavaScript, and our Apex controller still lives in Salesforce. All right, so now let's talk about what is a Lightning component. Ultimately, it's just a container for a bunch of files, right? It's a bundle where all the files intrinsically know about each other. So Visualforce, you're probably used to having to tell it, hey, Visualforce, I want you to use my controller. With Lightning components, you don't have to do that anymore, because when you create a component, the UI automatically knows what controller it belongs to, knows what CSS it belongs to, knows what helper it belongs to, knows what XML it belongs to, right? It's all bundled together. And so when we hear the term Lightning component, could be Aura, could be Lightning Web Component. We're going to focus on Lightning Web Component today. It's just a bunch of files that know about each other. Right? So like I said, we're focusing on the LWC side of things today. All right, so before we get into what's new with components, let's talk about what's not new, what's old with components. Right? There's actually quite a bit on the front end of Lightning Web Components, similar to what you already know how to do in Apex and Visualforce. Right? In Lightning Components, they still have a UI of some kind. Right? We're still going to have event-based code. We have them in triggers. Right? Database event happens, code runs. The only difference now, because the view is in the browser, we also have to be watching for browser events. So a browser event happens, and some code needs to run in our client-side controller. We're still going to have bind variables. We're still going to have to call methods. And we're still going to be using multiple files. And so I'm going to walk through what the differences are within these things we already know here. So on the UI side, right, in Visualforce, you have Apex tags. Apex page block, Apex button, Apex input. We're working with Lightning components now. We're working with industry standards. So with LWC, we're going to be getting default standard HTML tags. I don't have to Google Salesforce my tag anymore. I can just Google the name of the tag, and all the documentation will come up for it. Because they're Lightning components, we are going to get some Lightning tags. Instead of Apex input, we have Lightning input, but still just tags. And we're also going to be able to get some custom tags in our own namespace, the default namespace, which is called C. So you're going to see tags starting with the letter C. But it's all tag-based markup. We know how to do that already. That's not changing at all. Event-based code, again, right, we're used to this. Before insert, after update, database event fires, trigger code runs. That's not really changing either. The only thing changing is the name of the events we're looking for. So we're looking for browser events now. When a user clicks something in the browser, when a user changes something in the browser. On change and on click, these are the events we're looking for, and we're going to tell some code to run when these events happen. But again, it's just like a trigger. Event fires, code runs. Bind variables, those aren't really changing at all. We're taking away the exclamation point, but it's exactly the same otherwise. Curly bracket variable name. We can call our variable in our controller. Methods, pretty much the same thing. Again, we're taking away the exclamation point, curly bracket method name. If we're in our UI going to our JavaScript controller. We're also going to be able to bring in Apex controllers and give them custom names, and we'll see a demo of that in a little bit. And then the last thing is using multiple files, right? Right now, if you want to build an MVC app, you have to have a Visualforce page. You have to have an Apex controller. You might have an Apex helper. And that's not really changing. We have a UI file still. It's an HTML file in this case. We have a client-side controller now, a JavaScript controller. And we're still going to have our Apex controller as well. Right? So we're still using multiple files. That's not changing either. All right, so let's do a quick comparison of Visualforce versus Lightning Web Components here. And I'm going to bring up my Scratch org. All right, and hopefully people can see this in the back. But I have a component here. It says hello VF on the top and has an update button. And then we see it says the word hello. And then there's a text box underneath. So I'm going to go type something into this text box. I'm going to type in Dreamforce. I'm going to click my update button, and my text changes to hello Dreamforce. Right, not too exciting. Type something in, click the button, something happened. Right, making server calls this entire time. I'm going to do the same thing now in LWC. Right now it says hello world. I still have text. I still have a text box. But now while I'm typing in this text down here, I'm automatically seeing my text updating. And by the way, there's no Apex in this component at all. This is all happening in the browser. So what's going on behind the scenes there? All right, if we take a look at the Visualforce page first, right? It's nothing too exciting there. We start off telling it what controller we're using, the Hello World controller. We have an Apex page tag, right? We have an Apex page block, Apex page buttons, and then we have an Apex output text tag and an Apex input tag. Right? Our button is, we have a re-render attribute that's saying, OK, when the button is clicked, re-render my output value. I had to explicitly tell that to happen. My output text has a value attribute that says hello greeting, where greeting is a bind variable. And my input text has a value of greeting. Again, greeting is the bind variable. So I type in the greeting variable, the button gets clicked, and it says hello, whatever I typed in. And if I look at the Apex controller for this, it's one line, just a getter and setter for the greeting variable. Right? Nothing really too interesting going on there, but all of this is happening on the server side. Let's go take a look at the Lightning Web Component now. It also isn't really that big. just 8 lines. Instead of an Apex page tag, we have a template tag. Right? Every Lightning Web Component you write, just like every Visualforce page you write has an Apex page tag, every Lightning Web Component is going to have a template tag. It's a standard HTML tag. And instead of our output and our input, we're going to have something similar. Instead of output, we have a standard HTML paragraph tag. Again, it says hello greeting. Instead of our Apex input, we now have a Lightning input tag, but same thing essentially. And our output says hello greeting, and again, our input has a value of greeting. And here we see that event-based code we were talking about before, right? Remember, the trigger causes the code to fire. Here, our onChange event is going to cause some method called handleChange to fire, right? Bind method just like you're used to in Visualforce. And notice I don't actually have to tell it what controller we're using. Because it's a component, the Hello World HTML UI knows it's using the Hello World controller.js file. And this controller isn't very long either, just like our Apex controller wasn't very long. It's all happening in the browser. But I want to point out a few things here. The first one is this word import and export. So if you're familiar with Java, you're probably used to importing different libraries into your code and taking advantage of that functionality. Right? If you're a C developer, you're probably familiar with including different libraries as well. Same sort of thing here. And in fact, every Lightning Web Component you write, you'll always be importing the Lightning element module from the LWC framework. Right? Once we've imported that, we're also going to have a line to export it. That just allows us essentially to put our web component anywhere, right, in the browser, in another component, et cetera. And we're going to extend that Lightning element that we imported. We also see @track here. So @track is something called a decorator. We're going to talk about 3 of them today. And @track does a couple things. It tracks the variable and also has the property of making it a private variable. Right? So this is a private variable, private to this component. And this decorator also makes it reactive, meaning it's going to automatically re-render. So you saw when I was typing in my input, Dreamforce, it automatically changed my hello greeting output because greeting is being tracked. And we see it's defaulted to world here as well. So @track makes it private, automatically re-renders. And then down here we see that handleChange method that our onChange event called. And just like we can reference trigger.new in our trigger, we can reference the event that fired this method. So we have our event, and we're just taking the value from the event and assigning it to this .greeting. Right? So I typed in Dreamforce, it updated greeting, greeting knows to re-render itself, and hello Dreamforce started appearing as I was typing it. All right, so what do we see there? We saw component markup that we're used to, right? Lightning input tag. We saw code running based on events, our onChange tag. We saw variable and method bindings. We saw the controller was part of the bundle. We didn't have to tell it what controller we were using. And we saw no Apex at all in our Lightning Web Component. So we didn't have to make any server calls. It's all happening in the browser. And it's going to have improved performance as a result. All right, so let's take a bit of a deeper dive into Lightning Web Components now. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about why Lightning Web Components are a thing after we just launched Aura a few years ago. We being Salesforce. All right, so this is the landscape of the web in 2014. The words on the screen aren't necessarily important, but the green versus the orange definitely is. The green represents JavaScript frameworks, what frameworks we're responsible for. You've probably heard about them: Angular, React, jQuery. Everyone has their own framework, or is another one of them. And the frameworks were responsible for handling a lot of the web component development. The web standards in the bottom in orange were kind of lacking a little bit. Fast forward to 2019, though, and that balance has shifted dramatically. The web standards are actually very powerful now. And so you may be familiar with or may know of the developer tools in Chrome as an example. Right? Your web browser can actually handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you, and the frameworks can be relatively lightweight. So Salesforce responded to this in kind, and they said, OK, instead of having this heavy Aura framework that you then have to write, that we then have to translate to the web and takes some extra time, they said, forget it. We're going to join some industry standards boards. We're going to have a say in how web standards develop, and we're going to let you write web components directly so that we don't have to go through that translation process anymore, and performance will improve as a result. And we see our Aura programming model on the left and our LWC model on the right taking advantage of those web standards. All right, so we talked about what's old with web components. What's new with Lightning Web Components? What do we need to learn and be familiar with? Well, the first one is those industry standards, right? And why is this important? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, now you can go tell your buddy who's a JavaScript developer, hey, come over to Salesforce. The water's fine. You can do the exact same thing you're doing on your current web app on Salesforce. You don't have to put Salesforce in front of every Google search you make anymore. Just type in whatever component you're looking for, and it'll be the same across the web. Industry standards are also going to be good for your own career building, right? If you can tell people, hey, I know how to develop on the web. You can develop on Salesforce. You can develop off of Salesforce. They're losing that proprietary nature that kind of locked you into the Salesforce ecosystem. It also makes it much easier when you're recruiting Salesforce developers. As many of you probably know, it's not easy to do. But if you can say, hey, I don't need a Salesforce developer anymore. I need a web developer, potentially someone who knows Salesforce. Right? Salesforce security is still important. Salesforce clicks before code is still important. But the pool of people you can look for is going to be much greater. Right? Another thing we're going to see with web components is all of our logic is moving into one spot. Right? If you think about how MVC is supposed to work, your model is your model, your controller is where all your logic is, and your view is where all the UI is. And then we look at Visualforce and we see, all right, curly bracket, bang, some variable plus some string plus some other string plus some other variable, and it's all getting evaluated in the UI. And that's not how MVC is supposed to work. All of our logic is in our controller, and all of our UI is in our UI. We saw that we can import Lightning Element from LWC. We can actually import a bunch of different things. We can import from other Salesforce libraries. We can import our own components. We can import metadata, objects, and fields. And we can also import Apex controllers. And yes, I said controllers plural. Now you can have more than one Apex controller in your Lightning Web Components. And we're going to see a demo of that in a second as well. You don't have to shove everything that's unrelated into the same controller anymore. You can take advantage of that separate responsibility principle that you're used to and put the code where it belongs and just import it all. And lastly, we're going to talk about decorators. So we saw @track already. We're going to see two more. And decorators all kind of have their unique properties. They primarily allow you to connect data to, allow you to connect variables to methods outside of the component. And they also generally come with reactive properties, so it'll automatically re-render. They also have some input into public versus private attributes as well. Right? So all new with Lightning Web Components. All right, so I'm going to do a demo of a couple of web components now, and I want you to really focus on the concepts. Right? I'm not going to go word by word, but I'm going to walk through what the components are doing. And we are going to look at the code for them after we see them in the UI here. So let me go back into Salesforce. All right, and I have a component here called LDS create record. All right, and LDS create record has a few things. It has a disabled text box here that says ID. It has a name text box I can type in, so I'm going to type in Dreamforce. It has a create account button. It has a message here, create a record without writing server-side code. And it has a view source link that goes to a GitHub repository. And yes, all this code will be made available to you after the session. All right, so no Apex involved here at all. I typed in Dreamforce. I click on create account. I get a thing that says success account created, a toast message. And I see an ID here, something, 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 SAA3. And if I go take a look at my accounts now, I see my Dreamforce account. And I see, in fact, that ID matches SAA3. Right, so I created my account without using any Apex for my Lightning Web Component. If I decide I want a new account or I want to change the name, well, the ID is gone now because now I'm potentially working with a different account. All right, let's take a look at how we did that now. So how the heck do we create an account record in Salesforce without writing any Apex? Well, here's our HTML file to start with, LDS create record. LDS, by the way, stands for Lightning Data System, and that's going to be how we're going to be able to create records without Apex. And I want to point out a few things here. Number one, again, we have our template tag. It's like Apex page for Lightning Web Components, the standard HTML tag, and that's how you're going to start your Lightning Web Components. We then see a Lightning card similar to an Apex page block. We see our lightning input, again, similar to our Apex input. The first one for ID is disabled. The second one for name is there as well. And then we have a lightning button, similar to an Apex button. And then once again, we see a couple browser event handlers. Right? Remember, these are like our triggers. We're looking for our browser events. We see our onChange is calling some method called handleNameChange. And we see our onClick of the button is calling some method called createAccount. But we also had that little thing on the bottom that said create a record without writing server-side code. And that's actually another component called viewSource. And I bring it in using c-viewSource. So I can bring components in to my other components. You're also familiar, we talked about how in Apex, you can send parameters to methods. Same thing in web components. I can assign a variable, and I can send it to another component. So in this case, I'm setting some source variable equal to LWC/LDS create record. And then we have the text create a record without writing server-side code. Let's dive into that viewSource component for a second and see what it's actually doing. It's actually very small, using all standard HTML tags, including the A tag, which is a link. It says viewSource and has a link. And the href, where that link goes to, is some variable called source URL. And if we go take a look at that controller, we again see we're importing from LWC. We see we're exporting Lightning element. We see we have some base URL variable going to some GitHub repository. And then we see our second decorator, @API. So you remember @track has two things it did. It made a variable private, and it makes it reactive, so it automatically re-renders. Right? It tracks the variable. Well, @API makes your variable accessible to an API. It also makes it reactive, so it'll automatically re-render, and it'll make it public, so another component can see it. That's how we were able to send a value to the source here. Right? So we have our base URL, we have our source, we have our link going to source URL, and all that's doing is concatenating the base URL plus the source. Again, all of the logic being evaluated in our controller where it belongs, and not in our UI where it sometimes was in Visualforce. All right, let's jump back into our LDS create record here. And again, we have onChange calling a handleNameChange method, and our onClick handling or calling a createAccount method. Right, so let's take a look at the controller, again, that it already knows about. We didn't have to tell it what controller to use. And we see we're importing a bunch of stuff here. So again, we're importing Lightning element from LWC, that's standard. We also see we're importing from some Lightning libraries. So we're importing one called Platform Show Toast Event. That was that little green box that said success, your account was created. And we're also importing something called create record from the UI record API. So that's how we're actually creating the record without any Apex. Right, so we can import from LWC. We can import from other Salesforce libraries. We can also import other components. So I have another component called LDS utils that's being imported. We're taking in something called reduce errors. Right? So LWC, Salesforce libraries, other components, Salesforce metadata. I can import my account object and my account.name field into my Lightning web component and then use it. Right? And I gave it a name, some names, account object, and name field. Why would I do this? Well, two reasons. One, it's so we can demo that we can do it. And number two, it's because Lightning web components are actually metadata aware. And what I mean by that is you're probably familiar with, you created an object, you created a field, you put it in some Apex, and you realize, oh no, I have to change the name of this field now. And it says, oh, sorry, your field is in 30 million classes, we can't change it, sorry, you're out of luck. You don't have that problem anymore. Because it's metadata aware, obviously you can't for account and account.name, but if this was a custom object and a custom field, you could change the name in Salesforce. Your component will automatically update it here, and you're just going to be using the account object and name field variables you constructed, and those aren't going to have to change at all. Whatever the API name is of account, it's still going to map to my account_object. Whatever the API field name is of account.name, it's always going to map to name_field. So I don't have to worry about that problem anymore. I see once again we're tracking the account ID. That's why when I created the account and the account ID changed, it automatically showed up in my UI. And here we see our handleNameChange event. Again, we're capturing the event that called this. Right, we're setting the account ID to undefined. So that's why when I started changing my Dreamforce text, my ID went away. It changed, and so it got reset. And this .name, our account name, is just being set again to the value that fired the event. Our button was then calling our create account method. And again, remember, we imported create record from the record API in our account object and account name field. And we see here in line, this is 19, we just have a variable called fields. And we're just saying, hey, name field, what's your API name now? Right? It may have changed, may not have. I don't really care. But I'm going to put it in my fields variable. And I'm going to assign the value to this .name, whatever name I typed in. And then I'm going to do the same thing with my account. I'm going to say, hey, account object, go figure out whatever your API name is. I'm going to assign it to this API name parameter, add that as part of an attribute to this record input variable. And I add my fields as well. And then I call this create record that we imported from the record API using our record input. Create record is going to go create the account behind the scenes. And then you see as the code goes on, in line 23, we're assigning this .account ID equal to the ID of the account we just created. And then we're firing off our code to show that nice success account created green toast. All right, let's go take a look at this other component now. Now we're going to show you how you can use Apex with Lightning Web Components as well. So I have another component here. The UI isn't that exciting. But it just says contacts, and we have a list of contacts here, contact names. And then we have opportunities and a list of opportunities. We have the opportunity name followed by the opportunity amount. Right, so the component itself isn't that exciting. But let's go take a look and see what the code is doing. Right, list of contacts, list of opportunities. So if we go take a look at our Apex wire component here. Right, again, we have our template tag, a lightning card tag, some div tags. And we see this if true contacts.data. So you're probably familiar in Visualforce. You have the rendered if some condition is true. Same thing, Apex, you're used to this, right, if statements. JavaScript, the only web frameworks, if true, in addition to being if true, it also means if there's something there, if this is not null. If contacts.data exists, that's considered true. So if there's something in contacts.data, I have a for loop for each contact and contacts.data, just like an Apex repeat. For each contact and contacts.data, I want to display contact.name. Right? So contacts is some bind variable we can see has some attribute called data. We also see we have another thing here, some attribute on context called error. And if there's something in context.error, we're going to send it to some custom error panel component. And the opportunities, we see the same thing. If opportunities.data is true, we want to say for each opportunity, display the opportunity name and the opportunity amount. And if there are opportunity errors, we're going to send them to our error panel. Right, the controller for this is actually only 2 lines long. But we imported some things to start with. Again, we import Lightning element from LWC. And now we're going to import our Apex controller. Contact controller get contact list. So we're getting the get contact list method from our contact controller. And we're assigning that to some construct called get contact list. I told you can have multiple Apex controllers in a component, and I was not lying. Because here we're importing our second Apex controller, an opportunity controller, specifically the get op list method. The controller class code itself isn't very long. It's only 2 lines. They both use this third decorator at wire. So at track is going to track the variable, automatically re-render and make it private. At API is going to expose the variable like an API, automatically re-render, make it public. At wire is going to wire the variable to some other method. It could be an Apex method, could be another component method, but it's going to wire it to some method and assign the results to the variable. Right? At wire assigns 2 different parts to the variable. Whatever gets returned from the method is assigned as the .data attribute. And if there's an error, it gets assigned as the .error attribute. So whatever get contact list returns gets wired to the contacts variable, contacts.data. And whatever get op list returns is wired to the opportunities variable. So we have contacts.data, contacts.opportunities. If I look at the controllers, they're very simple. They have the @Aura enabled annotation. But it's just a basic SOQL query, select some fields from contact. Our opportunity controller, pretty simple. Select some fields from opportunity. Nothing interesting going on there. But once we return those values, we can go back to our UI. We returned those contacts we queried in context.data. We now have it, and we can say, all right, for each contact in context.data, display contact.name. If there's any errors, send it to our error panel. And opportunity is the same thing. For each in opportunities.data, display op.name, comma, op.amount. Right? Just like we would with our Apex repeat. All right, so what do we see here? We saw some more component markup, some more tags. We're used to that. We saw variable and method bindings. We're used to that also. We saw our 3 decorators, @track, private with re-rendering, @API, public with re-rendering, and @wire, wired to some method. And we saw that we can import from virtually anywhere. We can import from LWC. We can import from Salesforce APIs. We can import from other components. We can import Salesforce fields and objects. And we can import multiple Apex controllers. All right. So that was step 1. What do we do for step 2 and beyond? Right, we talked about how web development is already popular. JavaScript's been the king for 7 years, and it's not going anywhere. And we've talked about how Salesforce has devolved to join industry standards and meet the demand for these responsive designs. We saw a lot of similarities from front end to back end. And we also talked about how LWC, because it is an industry standard, it's not only the present but the future as well. And since this is just step 1, where do we go to for step 2? Well, there's a bunch of different links on the screen, and I will be posting these slides in the chatter group on the Dreamforce website afterward. But if you want to take them down, you can find the component library either via Googling, just like we have the Visualforce component library. We have the Lightning Web component library. You can also find it on the developer website. All of the code you saw today is available via, and more, is available via Salesforce's sample recipe gallery. They give you pre-built Lightning Web components you can pull down from GitHub, put it into any dev org, scratch org, and start using them. You can see how they work. You can iterate off of them and start building with LWC pretty quickly. Salesforce has their website for LWC resources, lwc.dev. They put together a trail mix, sfdc.co/LWC. And the Salesforce instructor that teaches Lightning Web Components put together a document as well, bit.ly/aura2LWC. All right, so that's step 2. You want to go even further. One thing we didn't talk about today is step 3, the Lightning Design System. This is very exciting. This is going to allow you to add custom styling, icons, images, accordions, progress bars, all cool stuff to really spruce up your UI and make it look nice to your users. That's open sourced as well, lightningdesignsystem.com. I forgot to mention, as of yesterday, all the base components are also open sourced. So if you don't like what Lightning Input is doing, you can get the code for it, upload it to your org, create your own component with the same code, and edit it to your heart's content. Lightning Design System also adds additional styling you can add without having to write the CSS yourself, and some custom utilities you can bring in as well. All right, so with that, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Adam Olshansky. Feel free to connect with me after, and I think we have 2 minutes if anyone has any questions. Thank you so much.